I hadn't driven down Willow Creek Road in years. The trees had grown thicker since I last saw them, their branches meeting above the narrow path like two hands pressed in prayer. It was strange, how a road could remember you even when you tried to forget it. Every turn carried the echo of childhood arguments, laughter, and the sound of my father's voice calling us in before dark. Harold Benton's voice, our father. Our grandfather's silence had been a law in this family, and now his absence carried the same weight. When the letter arrived, an official notice from Clarkson and Reed, estate attorneys, I knew the day would come. But reading, you are requested to attend the reading of the late Mr. Harold Benton's last will and testament, still struck something raw in me. There's something final about ink on paper, about words left behind by a man who never wasted them in life. I parked in front of the Benton house, or what was left of it. Once, it was the pride of our small town, a sprawling two-story farmhouse with polished oak floors, white columns, and that impossible scent of tobacco and fresh varnish that clung to our childhood. Now the paint had faded, and ivy crawled across the shutters like nature, reclaiming what was once its own. I stood there for a long moment, staring up at the window of my father's study. That was where he used to sit at dusk, reading letters or writing in that thick leather journal he kept locked away. A room no one had entered freely, not even after he passed. Inside, the air was heavy with old dust and perfume, that unmistakable scent of history. David and Evelyn were already there. David, my younger brother, sat near the fireplace, hands clasped, his head bent low as if in silent prayer. He looked older, though we were barely 2 years apart. His eyes had that same steady kindness that made people trust him, the same gentleness that once made me envy him. And beside him stood Grace, his son, the one who, even as a boy, reminded me of father in ways I couldn't explain. Grace had my father's stillness. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. He carried a quiet confidence, not arrogance, something deeper, earned. Evelyn, our sister, was pacing near the old piano, her heels clicking sharply against the wood. She'd always been the restless one, precise, deliberate, the first to speak and the last to admit she was wrong. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her clothes immaculate, but her hands trembled slightly as she held a glass of water. When she saw me, she said, "You're late," and I answered, "You're early." That was our dynamic, barbed politeness wrapped around decades of unspoken blame. We were 3 siblings who hadn't shared the same room in 5 years. Now, we were here to divide a man's life. At the long oak table sat Mr. Clarkson, our father's lawyer, a frail man in his 60s, always dressed as though every meeting was a courtroom battle. His spectacles caught the dim light as he shuffled through a stack of neatly arranged documents. Next to him sat Martha Avery, our father's longtime caretaker and family friend. She looked small and weary, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. "Thank you all for coming," Clarkson said, his voice low but firm. "Before I begin, let me extend my condolences once more. Harold Benton was a client and a friend. His will was written with clear intention and great care." His words echoed in the room like a sermon. No one spoke. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, making the window panes creak. I noticed the fire had burned low, casting uneven shadows that stretched across our faces. I thought of how, even in death, Father still managed to pull us back under the same roof, not through affection, but obligation. Clarkson adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. "I, Harold Benton, being of sound mind and deliberate will, hereby declare this to be my final testament." The opening words, familiar, rehearsed, yet my chest tightened as they filled the room. I watched Evelyn frown slightly, her jaw set. David leaned back, exhaling slowly. Grace, meanwhile, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "To my children, Martin, David, and Evelyn, I leave the knowledge that I loved you in the only way I knew how. You have all lived your lives according to your own truths. Mine, however, remains written in what I built." I felt something twist in me, that cold, bitter truth. Father's love had always come with conditions. He measured affection like currency, weighed in discipline and expectation. Clarkson continued, The Benton estate, comprising the house, surrounding lands, and all financial holdings, shall be transferred entirely to my grandson, Grace Benton. The words struck like thunder. Silence, absolute, unbreathing silence, filled the room. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. I stared at Clarkson, waiting for him to add something, anything, a clause, a condition, a division. But he didn't. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. This decision has been made with clear mind and reason. No other person shall contest or claim ownership, as this will supersede any prior drafts. Evelyn was the first to move. "What?" she whispered. "You're joking?" Clarkson's tone softened. "I assure you, Miss Benton, these are your father's exact words." David shifted uncomfortably. His face had gone pale. Grace, the sole heir, didn't speak, but his hand tightened on the armrest, knuckles white. Evelyn stood, her voice rising. "Father would never. This doesn't make sense. He never favored anyone." Her words carried an edge of disbelief, but I could hear something else beneath it. Fear, the kind that comes when you realize the ground beneath you has disappeared. I looked at Grace. He looked lost, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. And then I said quietly, "It makes perfect sense." All eyes turned to me. Father never did anything without purpose. If Grace was chosen, it wasn't a mistake. The words came out colder than I intended. Maybe it was resentment, maybe resignation. Maybe I wanted to believe there was a reason, that Father's final act wasn't as cruel as it seemed. Clarkson cleared his throat. "There is one more note," he said, flipping the page. "To those who feel wronged by this decision, I ask only this. Look not to the inheritance, but to the reason you were not chosen. You will find your answer in the silence you've avoided all your lives." The fire crackled, a log collapsing into embers. David spoke at last. "Mr. Clarkson, was this decision recent?" "My father, he wasn't well toward the end." Clarkson shook his head. "This will was finalized 9 months before his passing. I was present for the signing, as was Mrs. Avery." All heads turned to Martha Avery. Her eyes darted between us nervously. "Yes," she murmured. "He was calm, clear. He said he'd made peace with his decision." Evelyn scoffed. "Peace? He tore this family apart." Her voice cracked and she turned away, gripping the back of a chair for support. For a moment, I thought about what Father had written. "You will find your answer in the silence you've avoided." He'd always spoken in riddles, even to his own children. But this was different. There was intent behind every word. Grace stood then, quietly. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear I had no idea he—" "No one's accusing you," David interrupted gently. "You were close to him, that's all." But I caught the flicker in his voice, something uneasy, something unsaid. After the formalities ended, Clarkson gathered the documents into his briefcase, leaving us in the fading light of the drawing room. The air felt colder now, heavier. Evelyn left without another word, her heels clicking like gunfire across the floorboards. David lingered, speaking softly to Martha near the door. Grace stood by the window, staring out toward the garden where the old oak tree stood, the one Father planted the year Grace was born. I joined him there. "You okay?" I asked. He hesitated. "I don't understand any of this. Grandpa never told me." "He never told anyone anything," I said quietly. "That was his way." Grace turned toward me, eyes uncertain. "Do you think he meant it? That I was supposed to have everything?" I wanted to tell him no, that this was a cruel mistake, that Father had lost his sense. But instead, I said, "If it's written, it's meant." He looked down, silent. Outside, the sky was bleeding into dusk, orange, then gray, then the same deep blue that once marked the end of our childhood summers. I thought of all the will stories I'd heard growing up, the ones whispered in small towns where inheritance decided loyalty. This was one of those real-life stories, only this time, it was ours. A family secret wrapped in legal paper, sealed by ink and silence. And I had the uneasy feeling that Father's final act wasn't about wealth at all. It was about truth, and truth, in our family, had always come with a price. The next morning, Benton House was unnervingly quiet. The lawyer had left, the fire had gone out, and the storm that started late last night had turned the garden into a mess of wet leaves and broken branches. It was the kind of silence that comes after something important has already happened. Not peaceful, just hollow. I hadn't slept. I sat in Father's old study until dawn, surrounded by the things he never let us touch: his ledger books, his pipe, the framed photograph of Mother taken in 1979, the year before she died. I used to think Father kept it there out of love. Now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe everything he did was an act of penance he never explained. His desk drawers were locked, as always. But as I sat there, I noticed something. The outline of a missing key on the hook above his bookshelf, the one that used to hold the key to his safe. The safe had been sealed since before he died. Clarkson had never mentioned it during the will reading, which meant either it was empty, or it contained something Father didn't want passed through lawyers. For a moment, I considered forcing it open, but stopped myself. I didn't want to become the kind of man who searched for answers in someone else's secrets, but curiosity has a way of justifying itself, especially when grief has nowhere else to go. I decided I'd wait, see what David and Evelyn planned to do. But the more I thought about Grace, the more something felt off. He wasn't gloating, wasn't defensive. If anything, he seemed scared of what had just been handed to him. By noon, the three of us gathered in the dining room again, like some uneasy council. The old clock ticked in the corner, its pendulum slicing through the silence. David had brewed coffee. Evelyn had come armed with questions. Grace sat at the end of the table, shoulders drawn, eyes fixed on nothing. "I've thought about this," Evelyn began, her tone sharp but controlled. "Father didn't write that will alone. Someone influenced him, maybe even coerced him." David sighed. "Evelyn, no, listen," she snapped. "He was old, isolated. Martha was with him every day. You really think he drafted something this drastic without a whisper to any of us?" I could feel the resentment rising in her voice like smoke. "You think Martha tampered with the will?" I asked. "I think she could have," she said. "Or maybe Grace." "Enough," David cut in, voice suddenly firm. "Don't drag my son into this." But Evelyn wasn't backing down. "David, he's the only heir. You expect me not to question that?" Grace finally looked up. "I didn't want this," he said quietly. "You think I asked for it? I didn't even know he changed his will." "Then what did you know?" Evelyn shot back. He hesitated, and that pause, that brief flicker of guilt or memory, was all it took for her to pounce. "Tell us, Grace. What did he tell you before he died?" Grace's throat tightened. "He said he wanted to make things right." "Make things right?" I repeated, narrowing my eyes. "Right for who?" Grace looked between us, clearly overwhelmed. "He said something about, 'Not all debts are measured in money.' I didn't understand it then." Those words landed like a spark in dry grass. I remembered Father saying almost the same thing to me once, years ago, when we'd argued about selling a section of land he refused to let go. "Not all debts are measured in money, Martin." Evelyn crossed her arms. "So what? He thought giving everything to you would settle some moral debt?" "Maybe he felt guilty," David murmured. "You all know how much time Grace spent with him those last years. Maybe he just connected." Evelyn laughed bitterly. "Connected? He practically disowned Martin for questioning him, refused to visit me after my divorce, and now he leaves everything to your son because they took walks together?" Her voice broke. For all her anger, it wasn't greed I heard. It was heartbreak. For all of us, Father's love had been a puzzle we never solved. Later that evening, I found Martha Avery in the kitchen, washing a single cup by hand. She looked tired, older than I remembered. "Martha," I said softly, "can I ask you something? When Father signed that will, did he say anything?" She set the cup down slowly. "He said he hoped it would bring peace." I nodded. "To who?" She looked up then, eyes glistening. "To you." I froze. "Me?" She nodded again, trembling slightly. "He told me he'd wronged one of his sons. He didn't say which, but he said Grace would know what to do when the time came." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What do you mean?" "Grace would know what to do." But she didn't answer. Just turned back to the sink and said, "Some truths aren't meant to be passed through words." I left before she could say more. Because part of me already knew. Father's will wasn't about inheritance, it was a message, and Grace was the messenger. That night, I walked the property line. The field stretched out under the moonlight, endless and quiet. Somewhere beyond the barn, I saw a small figure, Grace, standing near the oak tree again, flashlight in hand. "What are you doing out here?" I called. He turned, startled. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Thought I'd clear my head." But I noticed the dirt on his hands, the faint edge of a wooden box near his feet. He'd been digging. "What's that?" I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. "It's something Grandpa told me to find after he was gone. He gave me a note. I didn't show it earlier because I thought it didn't matter anymore." He handed it to me. A small folded paper, yellowed at the edges. In my father's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "Grace, when the time comes, find what I buried beneath the oak. It holds the truth they'll need, even if they hate it." My pulse quickened. "Did you open it?" He nodded slowly and opened the box. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a sealed envelope labeled, "For my sons." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. We sat on the cold grass as I broke the seal. Inside was a single page, handwritten, dated 2 years before Father's death. "To my children, I know what I've done cannot be undone. I took something that was never mine to take, and it cost this family more than I can repay. The land, the house, even the money, they are not yours to inherit, but Grace's to protect, for he carries the blood of the man I wronged." I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. "What does that mean?" Grace whispered. It hit me slowly, painfully, the pieces aligning in my mind like a confession taking shape. Father's oldest friend, Henry Clark, Evelyn's ex-husband's uncle, he'd once owned this land before the Benton name ever touched it. Rumor had it, Father had won it through a deal, one that left Henry bankrupt. But there was another rumor, that Henry's only child had disappeared after the scandal. "Carries the blood of the man I wronged," I repeated softly. He didn't mean Henry's family. He meant Henry's descendant. Grace's eyes widened. "But it means," I said quietly, "you're not just his grandson by name. You're connected to both families." He stared at me, pale. "That can't be right. Dad." "David never knew," I said. "Maybe Father did something he never confessed to. Maybe Grace Benton isn't just the chosen heir. Maybe he's the proof of Father's greatest sin." The realization burned through me, cold and merciless. Father had built his empire on someone else's ruin, and Grace's inheritance was his attempt to give it back. It wasn't favoritism, it was restitution. When I returned to the house, Evelyn was waiting in the hallway. "Where were you?" she asked. "Outside," I said simply. Her eyes flicked toward the dirt on my boots, then to the folded paper in my hand. "You found something, didn't you?" I looked at her, the woman who'd spent her life trying to earn a father's love that never came, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Not yet. Not this truth. "Nothing that changes anything," I lied. But even as I said it, I knew the lie wouldn't last long, because the truth had already taken root, and like everything buried too long in the dark, it was bound to surface. The morning sun filtered weakly through the Benton house windows, painting the walls in pale gold. I'd spent the night awake, turning over every detail in my mind. The will, the box. Grace had uncovered beneath the old oak the letters and photographs. Every item told a fragment of a story that Father had deliberately withheld from us, his children, as if shielding us from the truth until it could no longer be avoided. Grace was awake early too. He sat at the kitchen table, the envelope open before him, tracing the handwriting of our grandfather with a reverence I could hardly comprehend. He seemed smaller somehow, burdened not by wealth, but by the responsibility Father had handed him. I approached quietly, careful not to startle him. "Have you read it all?" I asked. He looked up, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I think I understand, but it's more than I expected." "Yes," I replied, sitting across from him. "It's not just about inheritance, is it?" "No," he said quietly. "It's about righting wrongs, about truth." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the weight of the legacy he had been given. I leaned back, my mind racing. This inheritance wasn't meant to make him powerful or wealthy in the usual sense. Our grandfather had spent decades trying to correct a mistake he'd made, one that involved someone outside our family entirely, yet whose blood now coursed through Grace. Everything Father left us, the house, the land, the money, was tied to that restitution. And in choosing Grace as the sole heir, he had ensured the legacy of justice, or at least a measure of it, would be fulfilled. Later that morning, Evelyn demanded answers. She cornered me in the hallway, her voice trembling with frustration and a hurt I recognized from years ago. "Martin, you know something. You always do. Why him? Why Grace?" I hesitated, weighing my words. This wasn't just a legal explanation. It was moral, historical, and painfully personal. "It's not favoritism," I said slowly. "It's correction. Father made a choice, a deliberate moral choice. Grace was chosen because of who he is, and because of what Father owed, not to us, but to someone else." Her eyes widened, searching mine for confirmation. "You mean restitution? You mean someone got hurt and he chose him?" "Yes," I said. "And in doing so, he left the rest of us a challenge, to accept the truth, face our own shortcomings, and understand what legacy really means. It's not wealth, Evelyn. It's justice, conscience, and guilt," she interrupted bitterly. "You think you're so calm because you understand it. I can't." She spun away, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. I wanted to console her, but I knew it wasn't my role. This was hers to confront, just as it had been mine when Father handed me decades of responsibility as the eldest. David entered the room then, his face pale but resolute. "Martin," he said, holding a cup of coffee loosely in his hands, I think I get it now. He didn't just choose Grace because he loved him more. He chose him because Grace carries something that balances a wrong that we never knew existed." I nodded. "Exactly. It's why he asked Grace to protect the estate, to honor the debt that was never ours to pay. And in doing so, he forced us to reckon with ourselves." David sighed and sat beside me. I can't lie, part of me still feels cheated. But part of me understands. Grace's inheritance isn't about wealth. It's about integrity, responsibility, and reconciliation with the past. We sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree under which Grace had dug the box. I imagined Father's hand guiding him silently, ensuring that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. By late afternoon, Grace was ready. He gathered us in the living room, the place where all family meetings, arguments, and celebrations had been held. Evelyn, still tense but curious, perched on the edge of the couch. David stood behind Grace, hands resting gently on his son's shoulders. And I, Martin Benton, eldest son, and now reluctant historian of my grandfather's moral reckoning, sat quietly in the armchair, waiting. Grace held the letter and the photographs in his hands. "I don't know if I can explain this," he began, voice steady but soft. "Grandfather left something for all of us. Not money, not the house, but the truth. And the truth is hard. It shows what he owed someone we never met, and why he chose me." Evelyn's arms crossed. "And what about us? Just watching from the sidelines?" "No," Grace said, looking directly at her. "We're meant to see, to understand. We're meant to learn what responsibility and forgiveness look like. Everything else was never meant to be ours." He opened the envelope. Inside were the photographs and documents our grandfather had left, the proof of the debt, the history of the person harmed, and a record of Father's silent attempts to make amends. The images and letters were staggering. A young man wronged, a family displaced, an injustice corrected only decades later, and in the center of it all, the boy who would grow up to be Grace Benton, a living link between the wronged and the reconciled. Evelyn gasped softly. I didn't know," she whispered. "He never told us." David nodded slowly. "None of us did. But that was his plan." I leaned forward, finally speaking. "Father always believed that inheritance was more than money. It was about what you leave behind, morally and ethically. Grace is the heir because he is the one who can honor that fully. He's the bridge, not just to the past, but to the future." Over the next several weeks, the Benton estate was reorganized under Grace's care. He refused to indulge in lavish spending or personal gain, choosing instead to preserve the family lands, restore historical buildings, and create scholarships for young people in the town. a quiet, lasting tribute to the grandfather he barely knew. Evelyn struggled initially with resentment, but over time she began to understand. She helped Grace manage the estate's finances, her sharp mind bringing clarity to complex investments. David remained quietly proud, supporting his son and reconnecting with his siblings on terms of trust and honesty. I, Martin, watched all of it unfold from the sidelines. I felt no jealousy, only an odd sense of relief. I realized that Father's decision wasn't meant to punish or reward, it was meant to teach. And in that teaching, he had left a legacy far greater than wealth, the understanding of truth, the importance of justice, and the weight of responsibility. One evening, months later, I found myself back beneath the old oak tree. Grace sat cross-legged on the grass, letters and photographs spread around him. He looked up as I approached. "You understand it now," he said simply. "I do," I replied, "and I respect it. Father's choices were never easy. He never explained because he wanted us to find the meaning ourselves." Grace smiled faintly. "And we did, in our own way." I nodded, feeling the full weight of our family's journey, the betrayal, the secrets, the moral reckoning. It had been painful. It had been necessary. The sun was setting behind the hills, bathing the field in a soft golden light. For the first time since Father passed, I felt the heavy shadow lift slightly. The house, the lands, the inheritance, they were important, yes, but they were not the legacy. The legacy was what we learned about ourselves, what we carried forward, and how we treated the past when it demanded acknowledgement. In the end, inheritance is never just about who receives the wealth. It's about who understands the responsibility that comes with it, who honors the past without being chained by it. Grace Benton, the boy chosen as sole heir, carried more than property. He carried the truth of generations, the redemption of mistakes, and the promise that the Benton name, at last, might mean something beyond pride and possession. I left the oak tree that evening feeling a quiet sense of closure. My grandfather's will had chosen only one heir, but it had also given all of us a chance to inherit something far more lasting: understanding, conscience, and the courage to face family secrets, no matter how painful. And in the silence that followed, I realized that some of the most profound inheritances are not written in ink, but in lessons learned and truths revealed.
Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found it meaningful, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful, real stories from around the world.